The McCann case begins in the warm night air of Praia de Luz, where you can almost feel the smooth paper of the file beneath your hands. Settle in now, because nothing in this room needs to be hurried. We're only opening the first folder, slowly, the way an old investigator might open it, after years of careful thinking. The date at the top is the 3rd of May, 2007. The place is a holiday apartment at the Ocean Club. Apartment 5A, near a pool, a small restaurant, and quiet paths that gathered the day's heat in their stones. You sit with the McCann case as if the desk lamp has been left on just for this work, and the first thing you notice is how ordinary the setting seems on paper. Praia de Luz was not written into the file as a place of drama at first. It was a village of pale walls, tiled roofs, sea air, and evening meals, with the Atlantic just beyond the darkening streets. If you turn the page slowly, you can hear cutlery from the tapas restaurant, low voices from nearby tables, and somewhere farther off, the soft hush of tires moving along narrow roads. Madeleine McCann was 3 years old, almost 4, on holiday with her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, her younger twin siblings, and a group of family friends. In the file, the children had been put to bed in the apartment while the adults ate nearby, checking on them during the evening. You can picture the notation in plain police language, careful and bare, though behind every line there were tired parents, sleeping children, and a holiday night that had seemed familiar enough to trust. When Kate McCann returned to the apartment around 10 o'clock, she found Madeleine missing. The file changes there. But we don't need to make the moment sharp. We can let it remain what it became for investigators. A call, a search, a room, a door, a window, and a village suddenly asked to remember every small movement it had seen. The earliest minutes of the McCann case would matter for years. They were the minutes everyone later returned to, not because anyone could change them, but because old investigations often become a long act of rereading. You look again at the layout, the distance between the apartment and the restaurant, the low walls, the pathway, the poolside light, and the way a holiday complex can feel open and enclosed at the same time. The first responders had to work inside a scene that was already filling with fear, concern, voices, and movement. People searched, staff searched, friends searched, neighbors looked into streets and corners. You can imagine the night becoming noisy in a soft, confused way, with sandals on pavement, doors opening, Portuguese and English mixing in the air, and the smell of warm stone slowly giving way to cooler sea damp. For an investigator, that first night is always both necessary and imperfect. You gather what you can. You write what people say. You ask people to repeat times, routes, checks, and sightings, even while the clocks in their memories are still shaking. In the McCann case, those early accounts became pages that would be read again by Portuguese police, British police, private investigators, journalists, and later cold case teams who had nothing left to do but be patient with what remained. You sit with that difficulty for a while. The first night is not a neat diagram. It's a moving room full of people trying to help, and every helpful step can leave another footprint, another touched surface, another memory changed by worry. The investigator learns this early if they stay in the work long enough. A file is never just facts. It's facts gathered under pressure, in rooms where people are breathing quickly and trying to do the right thing. The Portuguese Guarda Nacional Republicana were called first, and the Policia Judiciaria, the criminal police, became involved as the night deepened. Their work began in darkness, under artificial lights, with witnesses tired and frightened, and with a missing child's photograph starting to move from hand to hand. If you rest your fingers on the edge of the page, you can almost feel how quickly a local search became something larger than the streets around the Ocean Club. But before the McCann case became an international file, it was first a set of small questions asked in a small place. You turn to the apartment itself, because every investigation starts by returning to the room. Apartment 5A was on the ground floor, with access from the front and from the patio side, and its position mattered to almost every later theory. You look at the plan the way detectives do, not to rush toward an answer, but to understand how people moved through space that evening. There were beds, shutters, curtains, a sitting room, and a children's bedroom where ordinary family objects had become part of a police record. The file does not need to make those things dramatic. A bed cover can be a bed cover. A window can be a window. A curtain can move in an evening breeze. And investigators can spend years asking what that movement meant, or whether memory made it larger afterward. You notice how much of the early investigation depended on statements. In those first hours, before forensic results and later reviews, investigators had voices, timelines, and the physical scene. They asked who checked the children, at what time, through which door, and what was seen or not seen. You can hear the soft scratch of pen on paper, the translation of words, the careful effort to make one person's memory fit beside another's without forcing it. Kate and Jerry McCann said the adults had been checking the children through the evening. Their friends also gave accounts of movements between the table and the apartments. These details became intensely examined over time, though at the beginning they were simply the map investigators had. You read them gently, because even a flawed memory can be sincere, and even a sincere memory can shift under pressure. One of the difficulties in investigating the McCann case was that time itself became evidence. A few minutes mattered, a doorway mattered, whether someone looked fully into a room or only listened from near it mattered. For you, sitting with the file now, these are not dramatic beats. They are the quiet mechanics of patient police work, the same kind of patient work that asks a witness to walk a route again in daylight and then again in darkness. The village also had to be read like a witness. Praia de Luz held narrow roads, holiday apartments, parked cars, low garden walls, and the sea beyond it all. Investigators had to ask what could be seen from one angle, what could be missed from another, and how far a person might walk while others were still looking in the wrong direction. You can imagine the air smelling faintly of salt and restaurant smoke as officers moved through those streets with torches and questions. There were reported sightings, some close in time, some arriving later, a person carrying a child, a stranger near the apartments, a car that seemed out of place. Each one had to be written down, checked, compared, and sometimes set aside. That is part of the quiet weight of cold case work. You don't only collect possibilities, you also learn to let some of them go. One early sighting came from Jane Tanner, one of the friends dining with the McCanns, who reported seeing a man carrying a child near the apartment area earlier in the evening. Years later, British investigators would say they believed that sighting could be explained by another holidaymaker carrying his own child. You can feel the file breathe differently when that happens. A detail that once seemed central becomes smaller, and a different page begins to matter more. That is how investigations change with time. Not always with a discovery, sometimes with subtraction. You remove what can be explained, and the remaining questions sit more clearly in the lamplight. In the McCann case, this patient rereading would become one of the defining features of the work, because so many pages were not thrown away, only returned to with different eyes. And when one early sighting softened in importance, another account waited quietly in the file. The Smith family, visiting from Ireland, later reported seeing a man carrying a young child through Praia de Luz around the time Madeleine was discovered missing. You find that page and pause with it, because investigators would return to it years later. The account placed a man away from the Ocean Club area, moving through the village, carrying a child in light clothing. It was not an answer. It was a shape in the distance. For a detective, such an account is both helpful and fragile. The witness gives you a time, a direction, clothing, height, build, and impression. But the night was ordinary when they saw it. They did not know, in that moment, that they were watching something that might later matter. You can almost feel the delayed weight of that memory, the way a harmless passing scene can change after a name is spoken. Investigators had to consider route and timing. They had to ask whether the sighting could fit the known movements around apartment 5A, and whether it could connect to Madeleine McCann's disappearance. This is slow work. It belongs to maps spread on tables, photocopies clipped together, and officers standing in streets at the same hour of night, listening to the village settle around them. You can imagine a detective walking the route with a notebook, feeling the mild slope underfoot, hearing a dog behind a wall, noticing how the streetlights leave some places clear and others softened. The file becomes physical in that kind of work. It's no longer only words. It's distance, pavement, breath, and the time it takes to turn a corner while carrying something carefully. Many sightings in the McCann case came from people who wanted to help. Some were sincere but mistaken. Some were too distant, too vague, or too late. The work of investigation was to receive them without contempt and test them without wishful thinking. You learn, as you sit with these pages, that patience is not passivity. Patience is the discipline of checking one more thing without letting hope distort it. There were also thousands of calls, tips, and possible leads over the years. Some came from Portugal, others came from Britain, Spain, Morocco, the Netherlands, and farther away. A missing child known around the world creates a file that grows in every direction, and each new report brings the same quiet question: is this something, or is it only the echo of a face people have seen too often on posters and television? For investigators, that kind of volume can be exhausting. You can picture desks covered in printouts, email logs, translation notes, and witness forms, with a kettle cooling in the corner and fluorescent lights humming above. Every lead has a human being behind it. Someone thinks they saw something. Someone remembers a van. Someone remembers a child's hair, a voice, a hand held too tightly. Each report deserves enough care to know whether it can stand. The Smith sighting remained important because it had a time and a place that investigators could test. Later, Operation Grange, the British Review and Investigation, would look closely at it after reassessing the earlier Tanner sighting. You can feel how the file changes when that happens. The old pages are not dead pages, they are waiting pages. This is one of the gentlest truths in old detective work. Evidence does not age in only one direction. Some of it fades. Some of it becomes clearer because other pieces have fallen away. When you return to the McCann case after years, you're not returning to the same file the first officers had. You're returning to a file that has been handled, translated, argued over, criticized, archived, reopened, and still not fully understood. Years later, the investigation would become less about one night alone and more about the long life of the file itself. The Portuguese inquiry carried the first burden. It had the scene, the first witnesses, the first searches, and the first responsibility to act in a village suddenly filled with international attention. You sit with that reality before judging any page too quickly, because an investigation under public pressure can become crowded with noise. Cameras arrived. Opinions arrived before answers did. For detectives on the ground, the days after the disappearance must have felt thick and airless. There were searches of roads, scrubland, wells, construction sites, drains, and coastal areas. Officers followed reports and looked for traces in places that smelled of dust, vegetation, seawater, and warm earth. The search work was practical, repetitive, and tiring. It was also deeply human, because everyone involved understood that somewhere behind the procedure was a child who needed to be found. You can imagine the sound of radios on low volume, boots on dry paths, dogs moving through rough ground, and paper maps being folded badly in the wind. Investigation is often less cinematic than people think. It's waiting for a callback. It's knocking on doors. It's writing down a negative result because negative results matter too. In the McCann case, those negative results accumulated like quiet stones. The early Portuguese investigation also faced criticism, especially over the protection of the scene and the handling of the first hours. Those criticisms became part of the case's public life, but inside the file, the work remains more complicated than a single judgment. You can acknowledge mistakes without turning people into symbols. Officers were working under pressure. In a case that became unusually large, unusually fast, the apartment was examined, statements were taken, searches spread outward, border alerts and media appeals became part of the wider effort. Madeleine's photograph moved across newspapers and screens, and the investigation became harder to keep contained. You can feel the difference between a local missing person inquiry and a case watched across countries, where every delay, every phrase, and every decision becomes public material. Then came the long middle of the first inquiry, when investigators tested possibilities that led into difficult and painful territory. Kate and Jerry McCann were made arguedos, a formal Portuguese status often translated as suspects. In September of 2007, their arguedo status was later lifted when the Portuguese Attorney General archived the case in July of 2008, citing insufficient evidence. You can state that plainly and carefully, because careful language matters here. To investigate is sometimes to consider possibilities that are later set aside. That does not make the consideration simple or harmless. It can leave marks on families, officers, and the public record. You sit with this part of the McCann case gently, because accusation, suspicion, and uncertainty are heavy things, and a bedtime file should not sharpen them beyond what the facts require. The forensic questions became especially difficult. British victim recovery and blood detection dogs were brought to Portugal during the investigation, and their alerts became widely discussed. Some samples were examined in the United Kingdom, and the interpretation of those results became controversial. For you, at the desk, the important thing is not to turn a forensic uncertainty into certainty. The important thing is to understand how investigators tried to make sense of imperfect traces. Forensic work can look clean from far away. In reality, it often smells of latex gloves, sealed bags, adhesive labels, plastic tubes, and rooms kept cooler than comfort. A lab report can carry cautious language that the public later reads with too much hunger. In the McCann case, that gap between scientific caution and public certainty became one of the story's lasting shadows. The Portuguese case was archived in July of 2008, though not closed in the deeper human sense. Archiving meant the active inquiry was halted unless new evidence emerged. It did not mean the question had been answered. You can imagine the file boxes being stored, their corners pressed by other folders, while outside the official room, the family continued searching, and the public continued asking. When a case is archived, it does not become quiet all at once. Phones still ring, letters still arrive, sightings still come in, private investigators may be hired, appeals may continue, and parents may keep a child's name in the world because silence feels unbearable. The McCann case entered that long, unsettled state where official procedure and personal hope moved on separate tracks. And after the first inquiry paused, another kind of patience began to gather around the files. The years after 2008 were not empty years. They were years of private searches, public appeals, legal disputes, interviews, documentaries, and fresh claims that had to be weighed carefully. You can feel how tiring that would be for anyone trying to keep the investigation honest. Too much attention can make a case visible, but it can also blur its edges. Kate and Jerry McCann continued to campaign for information about Madeleine. Their daughter's face remained known across countries, on posters, websites, and television appeals. For investigators, that visibility brought tips, and tips brought work. Every possible sighting needed triage. Every claim needed context. Every person who said they knew something had to be heard, but not every voice could be trusted. You sit with the difference between hope and evidence. Hope can keep a search alive. Evidence has to do something narrower. It has to connect, withstand checking, and remain steady when handled by people who are trained to doubt gently. In the McCann case, there was always a temptation, in public conversation, to move faster than the file allowed. The investigator's task was to move only as fast as the facts could bear. Private investigators pursued leads during this period, with varying quality and mixed results. Some work produced information that later entered wider review. Other work reflected the difficulty of trying to investigate across borders, languages, legal systems, and years. You can picture binders arriving from different sources, some neatly arranged, others uneven, with names spelled differently and dates needing to be checked against original statements. Cold cases often become translation problems in more than one sense. Portuguese documents need English review. Witness memories need careful phrasing. Police terms need legal understanding. Even a street name can become inconsistent across reports. When you sit beside the McCann case long enough, you begin to see that investigation is partly the art of making records speak to one another, without forcing them into agreement. There were also human costs in those years. The family lived with absence. Detectives lived with unfinished work. Witnesses sometimes found themselves contacted again long after they thought their part had ended. A person who once gave a statement on holiday might later receive a call from an officer asking them to go back, in memory, to a street lamp, a doorway, a passing figure, or a time they had not written down themselves. You can imagine what that feels like. The smell of the old holiday apartment may have vanished. The clothes from that trip may be gone. Children from nearby families may have grown older, yet the file still asks the same calm questions. Where were you? What did you see? How sure are you? Is there anything, however small, that you did not mention then? That is patient detective work at its most humble. It accepts that memory is not a machine, and it still listens. It knows that a witness may be wrong and still worth hearing. It knows that a lead may fail and still need closing. The McCann case, by then, had become a study in how long a question can remain active when no answer agrees to arrive. In 2011, the British Review began, and the file came down from another shelf. In 2011, the British Review began, and the file came down from another shelf. You can imagine it arriving not as one neat box, but as a long accumulation of statements, translations, photographs, timelines, maps, forensic notes, media appeals, private inquiry material, and the careful residue of years. The McCann case had become too large for any one glance, so the first task was not to solve it, but to understand what had already been done. The Metropolitan Police named the review Operation Grange, and that name began to appear beside the case in a quieter, more procedural way. You sit with the phrase as if it's stamped on a divider in a ring binder, plain ink on paper, nothing dramatic in it. A review is a humble beginning. It means going back before going forward, reading old statements as if the ink has only just dried, and asking whether any assumption had hardened too early. The work would have smelled of offices rather than sea air at first. Warm printers, dust in archive boxes, coffee cooling beside a keyboard. You can picture detectives in London reading Portuguese reports under fluorescent lights, while outside the windows the weather belonged to another country entirely. The McCann case, once rooted in a resort village, now stretched across desks, agencies, and languages. To review a case like that, investigators had to build a new index of an old question. They had to know which witness had spoken when, which statement was original, which translation followed, and which later version had been shaped by publicity. You can feel the slow discipline of it. Before anyone could say what mattered, they had to know what existed. There were tens of thousands of documents to examine, though the number itself is less important than the feeling of it. Page after page, file after file, names, times, maps, call logs, sketches, photographs, and notes that might have been handled by several different teams before reaching this new desk. You turn one page, and then another, and the work teaches you that patience is not a mood, it's a method. Operation Grange was not beginning in the warm shock of the first night. It was beginning years later, when memories had settled and public theories had multiplied. That made the work more careful, not less. Investigators could compare, sort, and test, but they could not return time to its first condition. You and I can sit with that fact quietly. Every cold case is an argument with time, and time never hands back everything it has taken. But with old files, there is sometimes one gift. The noise of the first days can be separated from the steadier material underneath. As Operation Grange reviewed the McCann case, the investigators began to sort leads by weight, not by volume. Some accounts were emotional, some were sincere but vague, some had been repeated so often in public that it was difficult to tell where memory ended and newspaper began. You can imagine a detective drawing a line down a notebook page, placing what was verified on one side and what only seemed possible on the other. This is the kind of work that asks for a steady hand. It doesn't reward urgency. It rewards the person who can sit for an hour with one statement, notice a changed word, and then check whether that change came from the witness, the translator, or the person taking notes. The McCann case was full of such small hinges. A time could shift, a direction could change, a description could become sharper because someone else had said it sharply first. The British Review looked again at the movements of the adults, the reported checks on the children, the physical layout, and the sightings that came before and after Madeleine was reported missing. You can rest your eyes there for a moment, because this is where detective work becomes almost architectural. It asks how a person could move through a place, what could be seen from a doorway, and how long it takes for one quiet path to meet another. When investigators reassessed the early Tanner sighting, they eventually found a likely explanation in another father carrying his own child back from the night creche. That did not solve the McCann case. It changed the shape of it. You can feel the file grow less crowded in one corner, as if a lamp has been moved and a shadow is no longer where people thought it was. Then the Smith sighting became more important in public appeals. It had been there before, but old cases often work that way. A detail waits quietly until another detail steps aside. You might imagine the paper as slightly yellow at the edges by then, the staple marks softening, the witness account still holding its place after years of handling. It had not grown louder. The investigation had grown quieter around it. The review also considered the possibility of an intruder, and it looked at patterns of reported offences in the area involving holiday apartments and children. We can say this gently and without detail. Investigators were asking whether the McCann case might belong to a wider pattern of suspicious activity near holiday accommodation. They were not working from a single idea. They were trying to make the file wide enough to hold more than one possibility. This meant looking at people who had been in Praia de Luz, people with access, people with criminal histories, and people whose movements or calls might need checking. It meant comparing old reports against old maps. It meant asking Portuguese authorities for help, and it meant learning the limits of a British investigation working on Portuguese soil. You can hear the quiet ring of international phone calls, the formal language of letters, and the rustle of translated requests. Years later, The review would become a full investigation, and the file would take another careful turn. In 2013, Operation Grange moved from review into investigation, and the McCann case entered a new official phase in Britain. This mattered because a review can recommend, but an investigation can pursue. You can imagine the desk changing slightly, the same papers still present, but now with fresh action lists, interview plans, and names to be checked more directly. The Portuguese authorities also reopened their investigation in 2013, after reviewing new lines of inquiry. For a case shaped by two countries from the beginning, this was important. The work could not belong to Britain alone. Praia da Luz was in Portugal. The first reports were taken there, and any search or formal action on Portuguese land required Portuguese authority. You sit with that cooperation like a quiet hinge in the file. International investigations move slowly for reasons that are not always visible from the outside. There are legal permissions, formal requests, language issues, different evidence rules, and the simple difficulty of keeping separate teams aligned. A document may have to move through official channels before a detective can act on it. A witness may need to be interviewed under one system's rules, even while another country's investigators are waiting for the result. For sleep, we can let that slowness be part of the texture. The McCann case was not solved by a single phone call or one late-night revelation. It moved through forms, meetings, rechecks, and delayed replies. You can picture folders traveling in padded envelopes, emails printed and added to binders, and maps marked in blue pen, then copied, then marked again in another office. In October of 2013, a British television appeal included a reconstruction and released images connected to the Smith family sighting. The public was asked again for help. This is one of the strange rhythms of a long investigation. A case can go quiet inside official rooms, then briefly become visible again, asking strangers to search their memories after years have passed. You, as the detective tonight, know how delicate that request is. A person watching at home might remember a holiday, a street, a face, or a small unease they dismissed at the time. They might also remember wrongly, or fold the reconstruction into their own memory without meaning to. Investigators know this. They ask anyway, because sometimes a truthful fragment survives in a person's mind like a pressed flower between pages. The appeal generated a large response. Calls came in, names were offered, old sightings were repeated, new possibilities appeared. You can imagine the operators taking details, the quiet clicking of keyboards, the officers sorting what could be checked quickly from what would need deeper work. In the McCann case, every public appeal brought the same mixture: hope, noise, sincerity, error, and the occasional thread that had to be followed. This is where patience becomes protective. It protects the file from being pulled apart by every claim. It protects witnesses from being believed too quickly or dismissed too easily. It protects the missing child from becoming only a symbol in someone else's theory. We keep returning to that tonight because it's the central discipline of investigating old mysteries. You hold the question without squeezing it into the answer you prefer. But after the appeals and rechecks, investigators also return to the ground itself. In 2014, search activity in and around Praia da Luz brought the McCann case back into the physical landscape. British police worked with Portuguese authorities to examine areas near the resort, including scrubland and open spaces. You can feel the shift from paper to earth. After years of statements and screens, investigators were again standing under the Portuguese sky, looking at ground that had been walked past many times. Searches like these can appear stark from the outside, but inside the work they are methodical and quiet. Officers mark grids. Specialists examine soil. Equipment is carried carefully. The sun warms the back of a neck. Dust clings to boots, and the sound of digging is practical rather than dramatic. You are not watching for spectacle here. You are watching people eliminate possibilities with care. The ground in such places keeps its own silence. Vegetation changes. Building work alters views. Paths that seemed open in 2007 may feel different years later. Investigators must use old photographs, maps, and witness descriptions to imagine how a place once looked. You can stand with them there in your mind, between the present village and the village inside the file. Those searches did not produce the answer. Many searches in long cases do not. Yet a search that finds nothing can still matter, because it closes one small space in the unknown. You write that down gently. Area examined. No result. Further review required. There is no failure in honest elimination, though from far away it can look like stillness. The McCann case had become known around the world, and that made every visible search carry public weight. Reporters watched. Cameras filmed. Commentators interpreted before officers finished their work. You can imagine how different that feels from the quiet desk where a detective first wrote the search plan. A private question had to be acted out in public, and still the investigators had to keep their pace. For the people of Praia de Luz, the return of police and cameras must have stirred old fatigue. A village can become known for one event it never asked to hold. Streets that belonged to residents and holidaymakers became part of an international memory. As you sit with the file, you can spare a quiet thought for that too. Investigations happen in real places, among people who continue living there. The searches were part of a wider effort to test burglary-related leads, local movements, and possible routes through the area. Officers interviewed people of interest and checked phone records where possible. They looked again at men who might have been in the vicinity, and they considered whether suspicious activity around apartments might connect to the night Madeleine disappeared. You can hear the patience in that work. It's not a leap, it's a narrowing. Phone data became one of the colder, steadier tools available to the later investigation. It does not remember faces or feelings. It records signals, towers, calls, and timings within the limits of what still exists. Years after an event, such records may be incomplete, but even partial data can help place a person near or away from a location. In the McCann case, investigators had to ask what the surviving records could truly say. There is a sensory stillness to that kind of evidence too. It is a different atmosphere from the search field. It belongs to screens, spreadsheets, quiet rooms, and the dry sound of a mouse click at midnight. You follow the columns with your eyes, time beside time, number beside number, knowing that most rows will not matter, and one row might. As the investigation moved onward, one truth remained steady. The McCann case was not becoming simpler with age. It was becoming more layered, and every layer had to be handled without tearing the one beneath it. Over the next years, Operation Grange continued with reduced teams, adjusted funding, and a narrower public presence. That is common in long investigations. A large early review becomes a smaller continuing effort. Officers change, supervisors change, budgets require approval. You can imagine one detective leaving a note for another, the file's history passing quietly from hand to hand. For listeners half asleep, this part may feel like stillness, but it's an important kind of stillness. A cold case unit often lives inside administrative rhythms, funding requests, periodic reviews, new tips assessed against old material, meetings where the same question is asked in a practical voice. Is there still a viable line of inquiry? In the McCann case, the answer, for many years, remained yes. The Home Office continued to provide funding for Operation Grange in stages. Each extension meant the British authorities believed there was still work worth doing. That did not mean an answer was close. It meant the file had not gone fully silent. You can picture a small team in a large building, still keeping the name Madeleine McCann on an active board, while many other cases passed through the same corridors. The public sometimes wants investigation to feel like forward motion. New search, new suspect, new appeal. But much of the actual work is quieter. It is reading, comparing, requesting, waiting, and sometimes doing nothing visible while a document moves through another country's process. You, as the detective at the desk, know that visible movement and meaningful movement are not always the same. There were moments when the case returned to the news, and moments when it seemed to retreat. Each return brought discussion, speculation, and renewed pain for the people directly involved. We keep our voice low here. We do not need to repeat every rumor that gathered around the McCann case. Rumor is not investigation. Rumor often asks to be fed. The file asks to be understood. The years also changed the investigators themselves. A detective who first joined the review might later retire, move units, or hand the work to someone younger. The case, meanwhile, remained the same age, and not the same age at all. Madeleine was always 3 in the remembered holiday photographs, while time outside the file continued. You can feel the particular sadness of that, without making it sharp. For Kate and Jerry McCann, anniversaries became public markers of private absence. Appeals were issued, statements were made. Hope was held in careful language. Investigators would have seen those dates too, not as headlines alone, but as reminders that behind each procedural update was a family living through another year without certainty. A case file may be paper, but it is never only paper. The McCann case also became a lesson in the effect of attention. Some attention helped keep resources alive. Some attention generated leads. Some attention distorted public understanding and placed heavy burdens on people who were already carrying enough. You can sit with that contradiction without needing to solve it. Attention is both lamp and glare, and investigators had to work under both. Then, years into the quiet work, a new name entered the public account. In 2020, German authorities announced that they were investigating a German man, Christian Bruckner, in connection with the McCann case. We say his name carefully, because naming is not the same as proving. German prosecutors stated that they believed Madeleine was no longer alive and that Bruckner was a suspect, while he was not charged in relation to her disappearance and denied involvement through his representatives. The file changed again, but it did not close. For investigators, a suspect named years later brings both focus and responsibility. You can imagine the old boxes being opened again, now with a new divider inserted. Where was he? What did he have access to? What vehicles, phones, addresses, and associates might connect to Praia de Luz in 2007? These are practical questions. They are also narrow questions, and they have to be answered with evidence, not atmosphere. Bruckner had lived in the Algarve region, and German investigators examined his connections to the area. Reports described vehicles, phone data, and his presence in Portugal around the period Madeleine disappeared. For you at the desk, the task is to keep each fact in its proper weight. Proximity is not proof. Suspicion is not conviction. A line of inquiry is still a line, not an ending. The international nature of the investigation deepened again. British, Portuguese, and German authorities each had their own roles, powers, and limits. Evidence could not simply be picked up and carried across borders like a loose page. It had to move through legal channels. You can hear, in this phase, the quieter machinery of modern investigation: liaison officers, formal requests, translated warrants, secure calls, and prosecutors choosing every word with care. This new focus also changed the emotional weather around the McCann case. For years, the public had lived with broad uncertainty. Now, there was a named suspect, and with that came renewed attention, renewed hope for answers, and renewed caution from those who understood how many old leads had already failed. You sit with that balance. A named suspect can feel like movement, but the investigator still asks the same patient question: what can be proved? German authorities said they had evidence supporting their suspicion, though they did not make all of it public. That can be frustrating from outside the file, but investigators often hold back details to protect the integrity of a case, especially if future proceedings remain possible. You can imagine the sealed folder within the wider folder, the pages not released, the quiet tension between public need and legal care. At the same time, the absence of a charge in Madeleine's case remained important. The McCann case had not reached a courtroom answer. No public official had presented a complete account that could be tested through trial. This is why careful language matters so much in old mysteries. You can follow the inquiry without turning allegation into certainty. The German development also reminded everyone how a cold case can be kept alive by agencies beyond the place where it began. A person known in one jurisdiction may become relevant to another. An old phone number can be checked against an old tower. A vehicle photograph may resurface. A witness who never connected their memory to the case may later see a name and come forward. The file waits for these crossings, but even with a named suspect, investigators still had to return to the old physical world of places, routes, and traces. The Algarve landscape reappeared in the investigation, not only as a setting, but as something that might still hold information. In 2023, Portuguese police, with British and German officers present, searched an area near the Irreversible reservoir. You can feel the change in texture again. Water, dry banks, reeds, soil, heat, and the sound of equipment moving across uneven ground. Searches years later have a particular quietness. They are both practical and almost ceremonial. Officers know that time has changed everything. Rain has fallen. Water levels have shifted. People have walked, camped, driven, and forgotten. Still, a search can be worth doing if a line of inquiry points there. You watch the work patiently, because the act of looking is sometimes the only honest thing left to do. The Irreversible reservoir search was linked publicly to the German investigation. It did not bring a public resolution. The McCann case remained open, and the known facts did not suddenly settle into a final shape. You can imagine the equipment being packed away, the search area quieting again, and the reports written later in the plain language of procedure. Location searched, items examined, further assessment ongoing. This kind of language can feel unsatisfying, but it belongs to the real world. Investigators cannot offer certainty because people want relief. They can only follow the available path, record what happens, and decide whether the path continues. You and I can stay with that tonight. We are not here to demand drama from a file that has already carried too much public strain. In old cases, the landscape can become almost another witness. Praia de Luz, the roads near the Ocean Club, the coastline, the scrubland, and later the reservoir all held parts of the investigative imagination. Not because places remember in words, but because human movement leaves possibilities in them. A car can pass, a phone can connect, a path can be walked, a person can be seen and not understood until later. The sensory world of the McCann case keeps changing as the years pass. First, the holiday apartment with its bedding, shutters, and night air. Then the police office with its statements, translations, and early reports. Then the archive rooms in Britain, with boxes and photocopies. Then the dry ground under search teams' boots. Then German prosecutors' files, holding another angle on the same absence. When you sit with all of that, you begin to understand why patient detective work has its own quiet dignity. It refuses to pretend the answer is simple. It refuses to abandon the question only because the question is old. And it refuses, at its best, to confuse public appetite with truth. The McCann case demanded that kind of restraint again and again. There is another detail we should turn over gently now, because it shaped how the case was investigated from the beginning. The media presence around the McCann case was unlike most missing person investigations. From the early days, Madeleine's disappearance became an international story, and the family actively appealed for information across countries. You can imagine the flash of cameras outside buildings, the shuffle of reporters' shoes, the murmur of press questions, and behind all of it, police trying to keep witness work separate from public noise. Media can help an investigation. It can spread a photograph in hours. It can reach a person who was on holiday and then returned home with a memory they did not know mattered. It can keep a case from being forgotten. but it can also create false leads, harden rumors, and make witnesses less certain of what they remembered before they saw the story repeated. You see both sides in the McCann case. For detectives, publicity changes the atmosphere of every interview. A witness may have watched news coverage before giving a later statement. They may know which details are considered important. They may feel pressure to be helpful. They may unconsciously adjust a memory so it fits the public version. You can hear the investigator's quiet caution in that setting, asking, "What did you remember then, and what have you learned since?" The McCann case also moved through newspapers, television specials, online forums, documentaries, books, and court actions. It became, for many people, less a file than a subject of argument. That is a hard environment for patient police work. The file needs narrow questions. The public often offers wide certainty. You sit with the difference, and you keep your hand on the page. There were many claims over the years that did not become evidence. Some were speculative, some were unkind, some misunderstood legal terms or forensic language. We don't need to repeat them here. A sleep narration can make a different choice. It can lower the volume, return to the documents, and let the people in the case remain human instead of turning them into characters for debate. Investigators had to work knowing that nearly every action could be interpreted in public. A search might be seen as a breakthrough when it was only a check. A funding extension might be read as a hidden discovery when it was administrative support. A silence might be treated as secrecy when it was simply legal caution. You can feel how hard it is to keep a calm method inside such a loud surrounding. That is why the quiet image of the detective at the desk matters tonight. You're not standing in the crowd. You're sitting under the lamp, letting the file decide its own pace. You read the statement, compare the map, note the uncertainty, and leave rumor outside the room. The McCann case becomes easier to hold, not easier to solve, when we give it that kind of calm. And once the noise is lowered, the human work becomes visible again. Think of the translators who handled early statements, carrying meaning from Portuguese into English and back again. Think of officers who had to ask painful questions in careful voices. Think of search specialists walking ground that might yield nothing, and still walking it properly. You can imagine the texture of their work: clipboards, radio static, paper cups, tired eyes, and the late afternoon light coming through station windows. A large investigation is never one person. It is a network of tasks, some dramatic only in the discipline they require. Someone logs a call, someone checks a car registration, someone enters a name into a database, someone reads an old report and notices that a date might be wrong. In the McCann case, as in many cold cases, the visible story rests on thousands of almost invisible actions. You can feel the humility in that. Most police work is not a single brilliant thought. It's a long chain of small, careful acts, any one of which might matter later. A form completed accurately in 2007 could help a reviewer in 2013. A witness description, written plainly, could be compared years later to another account. A photograph kept properly could avoid a question that would otherwise remain open. The chain can also weaken. Evidence can be contaminated, lost, misunderstood, or overtaken by events. Memories change. Witnesses die. Records expire. Buildings are renovated. Roads are altered. You sit with that loss too, because patient detective work is partly the art of working around what cannot be recovered. The McCann case carries that lesson quietly on many pages. For example, the early scene at apartment 5A could not be preserved in the way investigators might later have wished. People had moved through it. The urgency of a missing child search had overtaken the ideal conditions of forensic protection. That is not a dramatic criticism tonight. It is an acknowledgement of reality. In emergencies, human instinct often rushes toward searching, while evidence preservation asks for stillness. Those two needs can conflict. Find the child, protect the room, ask the witness, keep the witness separate, search widely, record exactly who searched. These are hard things to balance in the first hour, especially in a holiday setting where people are frightened and no one yet understands what the case will become. You can see why later investigators had to handle the early record with care. Operation Grange spent years doing that kind of handling. It reassessed old assumptions, renewed appeals, examined lines of inquiry, and coordinated with Portugal and Germany as new information emerged. Some of the work became public, much of it did not. A cold case investigation often has a public face and a private rhythm, and the private rhythm is usually much slower. You can imagine one winter afternoon in a British office, years after the first night, when the sky outside is already dark before work ends. A detective reads a translated statement again. The paper is warm from the printer. The room smells faintly of dust and toner. A name appears that has appeared before, but this time the detective checks it against a different list. Nothing may come of it. Still, the check is made. That is what it was like, again and again. Not one uninterrupted pursuit, but many returns. Return to the timeline. Return to the sightings. Return to the people who were nearby. Return to the witness who might remember one small thing after years of silence. The McCann case became a practice in returning, and each return had to begin with the same place, the same evening, and the same unanswered absence. If you look again at Praia de Luz on the 3rd of May, 2007, the map becomes quieter now. You're not looking for drama, you're looking for movement. The restaurant, the apartment, the paths, the street where a sighting may have occurred, the routes out of the resort, the possible vehicles, the places where a person could pass unseen for a short while. The time window is narrow and yet difficult. That is one reason the McCann case has remained so hard. The adults were nearby. Checks were being made. The village was not empty. Yet something happened within ordinary minutes, and the investigation had to account for that without inventing what it could not prove. You can feel the tension of that word, ordinary, and how much mystery can fit inside it. Investigators worked through the timelines repeatedly. Who left the table? Who returned? What was said? What was noticed? What was assumed? Each statement was placed beside the others, not only to find contradictions, but to understand human rhythm. A group meal is not a clock face. People talk, stand, sit, forget, interrupt themselves, and remember later in uneven fragments. You can imagine reconstructing the evening with a floor plan and a pencil, a line from the tapas restaurant to the apartment, another line to a neighboring apartment, a pause, a return, a reported check, a sighting. You mark each one lightly at first, because old cases punish heavy pencil marks. The first version of a timeline is only a beginning. The physical distance between the restaurant and apartment was often discussed, close enough to feel nearby, yet not the same as being inside. Investigators had to think about lines of sight, noise, access, and the assumptions adults make when a place feels safe. We can sit with that without judgment tonight. Many tragedies, many mysteries, and many human regrets begin in spaces people believed they understood. For the investigating officers, the family's holiday routine became part of the evidence, not in a cold way, but in a necessary way. What time the children were put to bed, which door was used, whether the room was checked by listening or entering, what was normal on previous evenings. The file asks these questions because routine can show where something unusual might have entered. The McCann case also required investigators to consider opportunity. Who knew the children were there? Who could see the pattern of checks? Who had access to the resort? Who might have been watching? Or who might have acted without planning? These are different questions, and each leads to a different kind of inquiry. You keep them separate as you read, because mixing them too early can confuse the file. Opportunity is not guilt. Presence is not guilt. A strange memory is not guilt. The patient investigator repeats those truths like quiet safeguards. They keep the work fair. They keep the file from becoming a mirror for fear. In the McCann case, fairness mattered not only to possible suspects, but to the integrity of the search for Madeleine herself. When British investigators later described their work, they emphasized that they were pursuing Madeleine's disappearance as an abduction investigation. That framing guided many lines of inquiry, though other possibilities had been considered earlier in the wider history of the case. You can hold that carefully. Investigations evolve, and the way a team frames its working hypothesis shapes what it looks for next. The abduction theory placed weight on stranger activity, local offenders, suspicious behavior, and movements away from apartment 5A. It made sightings and route analysis especially important. It also raised the question of preparation versus chance. Was someone watching? Was there an opportunity taken suddenly? Did any earlier suspicious incidents suggest a pattern? You read those questions slowly, because none of them answers itself. And in the long life of the McCann case, patterns became both useful and dangerous. A pattern can help investigators notice what isolated reports might conceal. Similar incidents, similar locations, similar times, similar descriptions, all can guide attention. But a pattern can also be imagined where the evidence is thin. You can see why detectives had to be careful when reviewing reports of suspicious men, attempted break-ins, or concerning behavior around holiday apartments. Each account needed its own weight before it could belong to a larger shape. Some reports involved strangers seen near apartments. Some involved possible burglary activity. Some were vague memories, made more significant by hindsight. The Algarve was a holiday region with many visitors, seasonal workers, residents, and transient people moving through. You can imagine the difficulty of identifying everyone who might have been near one resort on one evening years earlier. The work becomes like trying to count footprints after the tide has changed. Investigators checked known offenders, local records, and people who had come to notice for other reasons. They considered phone contacts and movements. They asked whether a person had access to a vehicle, a property, or knowledge of the area. You can hear the steady pace of that work. It is almost clerical in its discipline, but behind it is the deep human need to know whether one name fits the evidence better than the others. Many names would not fit. That is true in every large inquiry. A person may seem interesting until their alibi holds. A vehicle may seem relevant until dates fail. A reported sighting may dissolve after a better explanation appears. The detective's job is not to be disappointed by this. The detective's job is to be grateful when uncertainty shrinks, even by a small measure. In the McCann case, the shrinking was slow. One line closed. Another opened. Another remained uncertain because records were incomplete. You can feel the file resisting neatness. It asks you to accept that some questions remain open, not because no one cared, but because caring does not restore missing evidence. That is one of the hardest lessons an old case teaches. The public record sometimes gives the impression of leaps. A review begins. A sighting changes. A search is launched. A suspect is named. But inside the investigation, those moments are connected by months and years of less visible work. You and I can rest in that in-between space tonight, where most of the real effort happens. It is a hallway with low lights, stacked boxes, and someone still reading after others have gone home. And through all of it, the central name in the file remained, Madeleine McCann. Investigators could never allow the case to become only a puzzle. That is one danger with famous mysteries. People begin to argue about timelines as if they are solving a game. But for detectives and for any careful listener, the subject is a child who disappeared from a holiday apartment and was not found. The McCann case asks for intelligence, yes, but it asks first for tenderness. You can hold the photograph in your imagination without staring too hard. A young child with light hair, a holiday picture, a face printed so many times that it became known to people who had never met her. For investigators, such images are tools, but they are also reminders. Behind every appeal is a real person, not a symbol made for public debate. This is why patient detective work can feel almost moral in old cases. It keeps saying that the person still matters, even when years have passed. It refuses to let the file become only history. You see that in the continued funding, the renewed appeals, the cross-border cooperation, and the willingness to search again when a lead justifies it. These are procedural acts, but they carry a human message. For a family, the investigation's continuation can be both sustaining and painful. Every update may open the door to hope. Every inconclusive search may close it partway again. You can imagine the careful language families learn over time, how they speak of hope without promising themselves certainty, and how anniversaries turn the calendar into a series of quiet tests. For detectives, families are part of the work, but not the same as evidence. Officers must communicate enough, protect sensitive details, and avoid offering more certainty than they have. That balance can be difficult. Compassion and caution sit beside each other, sometimes uneasily. In the McCann case, with extraordinary public attention, that balance became even more delicate. You can imagine a family liaison officer making a call, choosing words slowly, knowing that every phrase may be remembered. There is a particular stillness before such conversations. A hand on a phone, a note checked twice, a breath taken. The work is professional, but it is not untouched by feeling. Long investigations ask people to be both human and precise. The McCann case also became part of a broader conversation about missing children abroad, holiday safety, media exposure, and international cooperation. But at the desk tonight, we keep returning from the broad conversation to the file. Big themes can float too far away. The file brings us back to names, times, rooms, and roads. It brings us back to what can be checked. And what could be checked had to pass through many hands. Portuguese police held their own case materials. British police held review and investigation material. German authorities developed their separate suspect inquiry. Private investigators had generated additional files. Media organizations possessed footage and interviews. Witnesses held memories in ordinary houses across several countries. You can imagine the McCann case as a set of rooms, each containing a part of the same unfinished question. Coordination among those rooms was never simple. Legal systems do not merge just because a case is urgent. A British officer cannot act in Portugal as if it were London. A German prosecutor cannot reveal every detail if it might affect a future proceeding. Portuguese authorities must follow their own laws and procedures. You sit with that complexity because it explains some of the slowness people sometimes mistake for indifference. There is a patience required of the public too, though the public is not always good at it. People want updates. They want reasons. They want to know what police know. But an investigation that reveals too much can harm itself. A detail held back may later test a confession, a witness, or a suspect's account. You can understand the frustration and the necessity at the same time. In the McCann case, that tension often appeared in official statements. Authorities said little, or chose careful phrases, and observers tried to read meaning into the spaces. You can picture the press release as a thin sheet of paper that everyone holds up to the light. The investigator, however, knows that not every silence contains a secret. Some silences are simply the shape of responsible work. The German suspect phase brought this tension into focus. Prosecutors indicated confidence in their line of inquiry while keeping many details private. British police continued to treat Madeleine as a missing person. Portuguese authorities maintained their role. The public heard overlapping but not identical institutional voices. You at the desk let those voices remain distinct. Blending them would make the story easier but less true. A case can have several official truths at once, each tied to what that agency can say, prove, or pursue. That is not the same as contradiction. It is the nature of law across borders. The McCann case lived inside that nature for years, and anyone investigating it had to become comfortable with careful wording, patient requests, and uncertainty that could not be hurried away. Then there are the records themselves, quiet, stubborn, and sometimes incomplete. Old records have moods of their own. A photocopy may be faint. A date may be written in one format in Portugal and another in Britain. A name may carry an accent in one file and lose it in another. A map may be marked by hand, then scanned, then printed until a street line grows blurred. You can feel the texture of the McCann case in those imperfections. Investigators reviewing such material have to respect the original context. A statement taken through translation on a stressful night is not the same as a calm interview weeks later. A police note written for immediate action may not explain every assumption behind it. A witness who seems certain at first may become less certain after years, not because they are dishonest, but because memory naturally loosens. You sit with this as a detective would. You do not scold the file for being human. You learn its human shape. You mark where a fact is strong, where a statement is approximate, where a translation needs checking, and where later publicity may have touched memory. The McCann case becomes less like a locked box and more like a weathered table, bearing marks from everyone who has worked on it. The forensic record carries its own caution. In public discussion, forensic words can sound final. In the file, they are often measured, possible, inconclusive, partial, insufficient, consistent with, but not proof of. You can almost hear the laboratory voice slowing everyone down. That voice mattered in the McCann case because some forensic claims became much larger outside the lab than they were inside the evidence. A patient investigator learns to love caution, not because caution is comforting, but because it keeps the work honest. If a result is inconclusive, the file must say so. If a sample cannot support a strong conclusion, it must not be made to carry one. You and I can let that be a quiet rule for the night. The truth does not need us to decorate it. In the same way, witness descriptions must be held gently. A person seen under streetlight at night, for a short time while on holiday, cannot become more certain because years of attention have made the case famous. The Smith sighting remained important, but importance is not certainty. Investigators could use it as a guide, not as a completed answer. This distinction may seem small, but it is one of the central disciplines in the McCann case. Lead is not proof. Suspicion is not proof. Search is not proof. Public belief is not proof. The file asks, again and again, what can be shown, what can be tested, and what remains only possible. You rest there, and the work slows into its proper shape. But patient work does not mean cold work. The people doing it carry the case in their own ways. Imagine a detective assigned to Operation Grange after the case is already famous. They inherit not only evidence, but expectation. They may have read headlines before they read the file. They may have opinions to set aside. Their first act of professionalism is to become quiet enough to hear the documents. You can see them at the desk, sleeves rolled back, reading without trying to be clever too soon. They learn the names: Madeline, Kate, Jerry, the twins, the holiday friends, the early officers, the witnesses from Ireland, the resort staff, the neighbors, the possible persons of interest. Each name has to become a person inside the procedure, not just a function in the story. That is slow work, and it matters. They learn the geography too. Apartment 5A, the Tapas restaurant, the Ocean Club paths, Rua de Escola Primaria, Rua 25 de Abril, the roads leading out, the beach, the church, the places searched, and the places only discussed. You can let the Portuguese names pass softly, like labels on a map under glass. They learn what was done well and what may have been missed. They learn which criticisms are fair and which are simply the luxury of hindsight. They learn that every decision in the first hours was made by people standing inside uncertainty, not by readers, years later with a completed timeline in hand. The McCann case becomes, in that sense, a lesson in humility. And humility is important when a case has attracted so many confident voices. The detective must say, "I don't know," many times. "I don't know whether this sighting belongs. I don't know whether this person matters. I don't know whether this trace can speak." Those words are not weakness. They are the beginning of honest investigation. You can feel how restful they are, compared with the noise of certainty. The work also asks for endurance. A lead can take months to resolve. An international request can wait in a system far from your desk. A witness may be difficult to find. A retired officer may need to explain an old note. A lab may need to review what remains. You come back each day, and the file is still there. That is what it was like, in large part, to investigate the McCann case. It was not always discovery. Often it was maintenance of attention. Maintaining attention is a quieter skill than solving. It means keeping a case present without letting it consume all judgment. It means remembering what has already been checked, so old errors are not repeated. It means making room for new information without allowing every new claim to rearrange the whole file. You can sit beside that skill tonight and notice how patient it is. In the McCann case, attention had to survive disappointment. Searches ended without public answers. Appeals brought many tips, most of which could not solve the case. Suspect lines developed and remained legally unresolved. The years moved on, yet the investigation did not disappear. It adjusted, narrowed, waited, and sometimes widened again when another agency brought new material. This is one of the unusual features of the case. Many missing person investigations lose public visibility quickly. The McCann case did not. That visibility brought resources and pressure in almost equal measure. You can imagine the file as both protected and burdened by the light on it. It could not be easily forgotten, but it also could not rest from public interpretation. For an investigator, public interpretation can be a kind of weather. You cannot stop it. You work through it. Some days it is only background noise. Other days it changes what witnesses say, what journalists ask, or what families have to endure. The detective keeps the file anchored to evidence because evidence is the only stable ground available. There were also legal actions and public disputes connected to the broader history of the case. We do not need to dwell on them tonight. It is enough to understand that famous investigations create many side files. Defamation claims, media complaints, book controversies, documentary questions, and arguments over access can all gather around the central file. They create paper, time, and strain. The central file, however, remains simpler in its deepest question. What happened to Madeleine McCann after she disappeared from apartment 5A in Praia de Luz? That question is plain. It is also unanswered. Every official effort, whether Portuguese, British, or German, has circled that same quiet center. You turn the page, and there it is again, waiting without impatience. Sometimes, in old cases, the simplest question becomes almost hidden by the complexity around it. The McCann case is a strong example. There are timelines, sightings, suspects, searches, laboratory reports, appeals, and years of commentary. But the investigator returns to the child, the room, the time, and the place. That return is not sentimental. It is necessary. And from that center, the later suspect work can be understood more clearly. When German authorities focused on Christian Bruckner, they were not beginning from the public fascination alone. They were pursuing a line of inquiry connected to his history, his presence in the region, and information they believed was significant. You keep the wording careful. He has not been convicted in relation to Madeleine McCann's disappearance. He has denied involvement. The investigation, as publicly known, remained a suspect inquiry rather than a resolved case. For detectives, building a case against any suspect years later is difficult. They need more than suspicion. They need admissible evidence, credible witnesses, records that can withstand challenge, and a timeline strong enough to survive close examination. Old cases are especially hard because defense questions are built into the passage of time. Where are the originals? Who handled this? Why was this not found sooner? How reliable is that memory now? You can imagine prosecutors reading the evidence with that future courtroom in mind. Every claim must be able to stand under a brighter light. Every gap must be acknowledged. A theory may guide investigation, but a court asks for proof. The McCann case, with its international history and public exposure, would make that standard especially demanding. Phone data reportedly played a role in placing attention on the area and period. Vehicles and properties connected to Bruckner were also discussed publicly. Investigators searched locations and appealed for information. You can feel the familiar rhythm again. Name, place, date, object, witness. Search, report, wait. The pattern of detective work does not become faster because the case is famous. German authorities also appealed for people who knew Bruckner in Portugal to come forward. This is another form of returning. The investigation asks old acquaintances, former neighbors, travelers, and people from a transient world to remember. Did they see a vehicle? Did they hear a statement? Did they know where he stayed? Did he mention anything? Each question reaches back across many years, and each answer must be tested. The Algarve in the early 2000s held many temporary lives. Workers, tourists, expats, seasonal visitors, people living cheaply, people passing through. That makes reconstruction difficult. A person might rent a place informally, use different vehicles, change phone numbers, or be remembered only by first name. You can feel the investigator's pencil slowing there, because every loose fact needs something firmer beside it. Public reports linked Bruckner to a camper van and other vehicles, and investigators asked for information about movements in Portugal. Vehicles are important in missing person cases because they connect distance to possibility. But again, possibility is not proof. A vehicle can place someone in a region, suggest access, or support a timeline, but it must be joined to other evidence before it can carry a case. This is how you read the file without leaning too hard on any one page. You let each piece remain its proper size. Some pieces are large, some are small, some are only markers that tell investigators where to look next. In the McCann case, the discipline of proportion may be the most important discipline of all. The public often asks why. If authorities suspect someone, there is no charge. The answer can be simple and unsatisfying. Suspicion and proof are different thresholds. Prosecutors may believe a person is responsible and still lack the evidence needed to bring a charge that can stand. You can sit with that gap quietly. It is one of the most difficult spaces in criminal investigation. And while that suspect inquiry continued, the older work did not vanish. Operation Grange remained connected to the broader investigation and continued to receive and assess information. Portuguese authorities maintained involvement. German prosecutors pursued their line. The McCann case, by then, was not a single road but several lanes moving beside one another, sometimes close, sometimes apart. You can picture the files on 3 desks in 3 countries, each with a different legal cover, all bearing the same child's name. This multi-country structure can feel frustrating because it slows simple answers, but it can also preserve rigor. Each agency has to work within its authority. Each has to record what it knows. Each has to decide what can be shared and when. In a case where future legal action may depend on careful procedure, that slowness is not only bureaucracy, it can be protection. You, as the quiet detective tonight, can keep your place by returning to the evidence types, witness accounts, scene records, forensic material, phone data, suspect histories, search results, public appeals. Each type has its own strength and weakness. Witnesses can remember human detail, but memory shifts. Phone data can be precise, but incomplete. Searches can eliminate ground, but not all possibility. Forensics can speak strongly, or not at all. The investigation is the art of making these different voices listen to each other. If a witness saw a person at a certain time, do the phone records allow it? If a suspect had a vehicle, do sightings or registrations support movement? If a search area is proposed, what evidence points there? You can imagine a board with threads, but the real work is less theatrical, more like careful columns in a spreadsheet, and notes written in restrained language. By now, the McCann case had also become part of institutional memory. Younger officers might know it as history before they ever touched the file. Senior officers might remember earlier press briefings, earlier appeals, earlier disappointments. Institutional memory can help, but it can also carry assumptions. A good review asks old knowledge to prove itself again. That is why cold case work often begins with a fresh pair of eyes, not because earlier investigators were careless by nature, but because every team sees through the limits of its moment. New tools, new databases, new witnesses, and new perspectives can change what is visible. In the McCann case, the movement from Portuguese inquiry to British review to German suspect inquiry shows that no single moment contained all possible work. Cold case investigators often speak of the value of persistence, but persistence alone is not enough. It must be paired with humility, because the file may not reward effort with an answer. You can work carefully for years and still end with uncertainty. The McCann case has asked investigators to accept that possibility while continuing anyway, which is perhaps the hardest kind of professional patience. There was one more kind of evidence that shaped the later years, and it lived not in a lab or a search field, but in the memories of strangers. Public appeals depend on strangers deciding that a memory is worth sharing. That sounds simple, but it's delicate. People hesitate. They worry they are wrong. They think too much time has passed. They wonder whether police already know. In the McCann case, appeals over the years repeatedly asked people to overcome that hesitation. You can imagine someone pausing in a kitchen, hearing a name on the radio, and remembering a conversation from long ago. Investigators then had to receive those memories without either overvaluing or dismissing them. A tip may arrive in a hurried voice. It may be written in uncertain spelling. It may include feelings rather than facts. The officer's task is to draw out what can be checked. When did this happen? Where were you? Who else was there? How did you know the person? Have you seen media coverage since? This kind of interview work is gentle but exacting. You cannot bully memory into accuracy. You have to let it settle, then ask for anchors. A date tied to a holiday, a place tied to a receipt, a vehicle tied to a photograph, a person tied to a landlord, employer, or phone number. You can feel the file reaching for fixed points, like a hand searching for the edge of a table in a dark room. Some witnesses may bring useful fragments years later, others may bring only echoes. Still, the act of listening matters. Cold case work often depends on someone who was not ready before, or did not understand before. Finally speaking, in the McCann case, authorities continued to appeal because the possibility of such a person remained alive. The challenge is that famous cases attract false information too. Some people insert themselves into investigations. Some misremember sincerely. Some seek attention. Some confuse dreams, media images, or unrelated events with fact. You can see why investigators must be both open and guarded. Their kindness cannot replace skepticism, and their skepticism cannot erase kindness. That balance gives the work its quiet shape. You listen, you check, you document, you decide whether the lead continues. Then you return to the file. The McCann case, across its long life, has likely contained thousands of such small cycles, each beginning with a human voice and ending somewhere in the records. And all the while, time kept moving outside the investigation rooms. Children who were toddlers in 2007 grew into adults. Officers retired. Technologies changed. The way people used phones changed. The way police stored and searched data changed. News moved from newspapers and television into social media feeds, where rumor could travel even faster than before. The McCann case aged inside a changing world, and investigators had to keep translating it into the tools of each new period. In the first days, mobile phone data existed, but it was not the rich location record people imagine today. CCTV coverage was not everywhere. Digital photographs were less seamlessly stored. Social media did not function as it later would. You can feel the difference. A modern case begins with oceans of data. The McCann case began in a world where many traces were still partial, local, or quickly lost. That makes later investigation harder. You cannot collect what was never saved. You cannot replay cameras that were not there. You cannot retrieve call records beyond retention limits unless they were preserved. Cold case investigators live with these absences. They become part of the file, almost like blank pages inserted between the written ones. Yet technology also helped in some ways. Databases improved. Cross-border communication improved. Forensic methods advanced, though only where usable material existed. Digital organization allowed large files to be searched and compared differently. You can imagine an old witness name, once buried in a paper folder, becoming easier to find when entered into a searchable system. The old file met new tools, slowly. Still, no tool removes the need for judgment. A database can show a match, but a detective must understand whether it matters. A search can produce a name, but someone must read the original report. In the McCann case, as in many patient investigations, technology became an aid to human attention, not a replacement for it. The human attention had to stay soft enough to notice small things and firm enough not to drift. That is a rare combination. It's the attention of someone used to late evenings with old records, someone who can hear rain tapping against the window and still compare 2 times written years apart. You can settle into that kind of attention now, because it is the very atmosphere of this case. Another bridge in the file brings us back to the village, because every later development still leads there eventually. Praia da Luz remains the physical heart of the McCann case. No matter how many offices, courts, agencies, and countries became involved, the central map returns to that resort town on the Algarve. You can picture it in daylight now, not only at night. White buildings in sun, blue signs, paved walkways, the smell of coffee and sea salt. Ordinary life moving carefully around an extraordinary memory. Investigators returning there years later had to see both the current place and the past place. A wall may have been painted, a business may have changed, trees may have grown, a view may be altered by construction or neglect. You stand in the present and hold an old photograph, aligning roof lines, counting steps, trying to make time transparent enough to look through. This is one of the quiet skills of scene reconstruction. It asks you to imagine without inventing. You use measurements, photographs, original statements, and maps, but you also need the humility to say when a present view cannot perfectly reproduce the past. In the McCann case, years of return visits and reconstructions had to negotiate that gap. The Ocean Club itself became a place many people knew from images rather than experience. Apartment 5A became more than an apartment in public memory, though in physical reality it remained walls, rooms, doors, and windows. Investigators had to keep it physical. They had to resist symbolism and ask practical questions. How was the room entered? What could be opened? What could be seen? What route was simplest? You can almost hear a measuring tape being extended, a camera shutter, a low conversation between officers comparing notes. This is the opposite of spectacle. It is the quiet reduction of a place into testable details, done not to diminish its human meaning, but to make investigation possible. The surrounding streets mattered too. If the Smith sighting was relevant, then the route through Praia de Luz mattered. If a vehicle was involved, parking and exit routes mattered. If someone watched the apartment beforehand, lines of sight mattered. The village becomes a set of questions asked through pavement, corners, light, and distance. You walk it slowly in your mind. At night, small villages change. A street that feels open in daylight becomes private. A doorway becomes shadowed. Sound carries differently. The sea may be heard more clearly. A person carrying a child might be noticed by one family and missed by another. You can understand why investigators would revisit routes at similar hours, letting the place teach them what paper could not. But place alone cannot answer. It can only support or resist a theory. A route may be possible, a sighting may fit, a timing may work. Then the investigator still asks, where is the evidence that this happened? The McCann case repeatedly invites that discipline. It offers many possible paths, and the patient detective must walk only as far as the evidence permits. So we return again to the paperwork, to the archive air, to the desks where possible paths are compared. By the time multiple agencies had handled the McCann case, the paperwork itself had become a landscape. There were original Portuguese statements, British review documents, German investigative materials, media transcripts, private investigator notes, and legal records. Not all of these held equal value. Not all were equally reliable. You can imagine sorting them into layers, the oldest, closest to the event, later material handled with special care. The oldest statements often carry immediacy, but they can also carry confusion. Later statements may be calmer, but they can be influenced by time and publicity. Official records may be structured, while private notes may contain useful leads, but less formal method. A detective reviewing the McCann case had to understand the kind of document before trusting what it seemed to say. This is almost like archival work. The paper has provenance. Who created it? When? For what purpose? Under what conditions? Was it translated? Was it summarized? Was it quoted by someone else? You can feel the quiet pleasure of that method, even inside a sad case, because order is one way humans show respect for what happened. Sometimes the most important act is simply finding the right original. A quote repeated in a newspaper may differ from the police statement. A time in a summary may be rounded. A witness's uncertainty may disappear in retelling. The patient investigator goes back to the source whenever possible. You do the same at the desk tonight, letting the file teach you to prefer the first clear record over the loudest later version. This mattered especially because the McCann case attracted so much commentary. Public theories often selected details and ignored context. Investigation cannot do that. It must carry the inconvenient details too. It must keep the weak parts of a theory visible. It must record when a promising lead fails. That honesty is not dramatic, but it is the only kind that can last. You can imagine an officer writing a closing note on a lead after weeks of work. The person identified. Account checked. No connection established. No further action at this time. Such lines may feel empty to the public, but they are part of the architecture of a serious investigation. They prevent the same uncertainty from consuming future time. In a case this large, avoiding repetition is itself a task. One team may check something another team checked years earlier, unless the record is clear. A name may appear under different spellings, A rumor may be submitted as a fresh tip by someone who found it online. The McCann case required systems that could recognize old material wearing new clothes. And when investigators could not close a lead, they had to decide how to hold it. Some leads remain unresolved because evidence is absent, not because suspicion is strong. This is a subtle distinction. A person may be untraced. A vehicle may be unidentified. A sighting may remain unexplained. That does not mean it is central. It means the file cannot file it away completely. You can see the rows of such material, each marked with caution rather than certainty. The Smith sighting, for example, remained a notable account because of timing and content, but it did not identify a person beyond doubt. Other sightings from the region and later reports of possible appearances of Madeleine around the world were assessed, but most did not hold. The McCann case, like many missing child cases, accumulated hope in distant places, and investigators had to test those hopes one by one. Testing a possible sighting of a missing child is tender work. Someone thinks they have seen the child alive. A family may hear of it. The public may hope. Investigators must compare age, appearance, context, travel records, and sometimes local inquiries. Many such leads end quietly. A child is identified as someone else. A memory proves mistaken. The file grows by one closed possibility. You can feel the ache in that process, but also the necessity. To leave every sighting open would be unbearable and unworkable. To dismiss them without checking would be careless. So the investigation walks the middle path, slowly, with enough hope to look and enough discipline to know when a look has ended. The McCann case asked for that middle path again and again. It asked it of Portuguese officers, British reviewers, German prosecutors, private searchers, and ordinary people who came forward. The case did not become patient by choice. It became patient because no single answer arrived. And in that patience, the investigators had to learn how to live with uncertainty without becoming numb to it. And in that patience, the investigators had to learn how to live with uncertainty without becoming numb to it. That is harder than it sounds, because uncertainty repeated for years can begin to feel like furniture in the room. You stop noticing its outline unless you make yourself look again. In the McCann case, the discipline was to keep noticing. A detective can become too familiar with a file. The names begin to sit in known places. The sightings take on settled importance. The old doubts become so well worn that they almost feel answered, even when they are not. You can imagine the careful officer pausing before that happens, closing the folder for a moment, then opening it as if it were new. That kind of reopening is not a trick. It is a practice. You ask the basic questions again, not because you forgot them, but because familiarity can soften the edge of inquiry. Who was there? What was seen? What was assumed? What was checked? What was not checked because it seemed less urgent at the time? The McCann case required that return because its first hours remained both essential and imperfect. You could not build a serious investigation without them, and you could not trust them without caution. The early room, the early statements, the early searches, and the early sightings all had to be held in that middle space. They mattered deeply, and they had limits. This is where the work becomes almost meditative. You read and you pause, you compare and you wait. You let the same sentence rest in the mind long enough to notice what it does and does not say. The file does not reward force. It rewards a patient ear. There is a faint sound in that imagined room, perhaps the low hum of heating or rain against a high window, while the McCann case lies open under a lamp. The paper is ordinary paper, the ink is ordinary ink, yet the attention given to it is anything but ordinary, because every small correction may keep the investigation honest. And honesty, in a case so publicly argued, became one of the quietest forms of care. You can see this most clearly in the way investigators had to handle competing theories. The McCann case gathered many explanations over time, some official, some public, some reasonable to examine, and some unsupported from the beginning. A detective cannot simply choose the theory that feels neatest. The theory has to keep passing through evidence, like light through thin paper. Early Portuguese investigators considered several possibilities, including parental involvement, stranger abduction, accident, and opportunistic crime. Later, British investigators publicly worked the case as an abduction inquiry, while German authorities focused on a named suspect. These shifts can seem confusing from outside. Inside the file, they reflect changing assessments, different agencies, and new information arriving at different times. You sit with that without trying to flatten it. It is possible for an investigation to examine one route and later move to another. It is possible for an early suspicion to be formally lifted. It is possible for a later suspect to be named without the case reaching a charge. The McCann case asks you to let these legal and investigative distinctions remain intact. This careful distinction mattered for Kate and Jerry McCann. They were made arguidos in Portugal in 2007, and that status was lifted when the case was archived in 2008. That sequence belongs in the file exactly as it is, without extra weight placed upon it. You, as the listener and detective tonight, keep the language measured, because measured language is part of fairness. The same fairness applies to any named suspect. Christian Bruckner became a focus of the German investigation, and Portuguese authorities later made him an arguido in their system. He has denied involvement, and he has not been convicted in relation to Madeleine McCann's disappearance. The file may contain suspicions and lines of inquiry, but we do not turn them into verdicts. For investigators, fairness is not softness. It is rigor. A case built on overstatement weakens itself. A case that respects uncertainty may feel less satisfying, but it has a better chance of surviving challenge. You can think of that as one of the quiet rules on the desk tonight. The true thing does not need louder words than it deserves. The public often struggles with this because uncertainty can feel like evasion. People want police to say what they know. They want prosecutors to reveal why they believe what they believe. They want the story to take shape. But an investigation must protect the shape until it can stand. And sometimes it never stands enough to be spoken fully. That is not romance. It is paperwork, law, and evidence. It is the slow checking of whether a statement can be admitted, whether a search was lawful, whether a witness can be located, whether a phone record can be authenticated, whether one country's material can be used in another country's court. You can hear the quiet machinery turning behind the public silence. And beneath that machinery, there remained the practical labor of following leads. A lead in the McCann case might begin with a phone call, a letter, an email, or a message passed through another agency. It might be a person saying they remembered a man in the Algarve. It might be a report about a vehicle. It might be a name linked to an old accommodation record. You picture the intake process, calm and deliberate, turning human uncertainty into a form that can be checked. First, the lead must be logged. Then it must be assessed. Is it new, or has it appeared before? Is it specific enough to follow? Does it include dates, places, names, numbers, photographs, or documents? Does it come from a reliable source, or from someone repeating something they saw online? The investigator asks these questions without contempt, because even an untidy lead can contain one useful thread. In an old case, duplication is constant. People discover an old theory and submit it as new. A sighting already checked years earlier returns through another route. A name appears with a slightly different spelling. You can imagine an officer searching the database, finding the older entry, and adding a careful note, so the file remains tidy. This is not glamorous work, it is the plumbing of truth. Sometimes, however, a lead contains enough fresh detail to move forward. Then the work becomes wider. Locate the witness, check the records, ask another agency, compare against known timelines, look for corroboration. You can feel how one small lead can open several small doors, each requiring a polite knock and a wait. The McCann case produced leads across countries, which meant time zones, languages, and legal pathways. A call from Britain might point to Portugal. A German inquiry might touch a Portuguese location. A witness from Ireland might describe a street in Praia de Luz. The file crossed borders long before any answer did. This is why liaison work mattered so much. Investigators needed relationships between agencies, not only formal requests. They needed people who understood the case well enough to recognize what a question meant. A badly framed request can lose time. A carefully framed one can make another officer's work easier. You can imagine the quiet skill in writing such a request, exact, respectful, and clear. There is a gentleness in administrative competence that people rarely notice. A well-labeled evidence request, a properly translated statement, a timeline, formatted, so another team can follow it. These are small courtesies between professionals. But in a case like the McCann case, they can shape whether a lead moves smoothly or stalls. You can almost smell the office paper here, the faint dryness of toner, the slightly stale air near filing cabinets, the cool touch of a metal drawer handle. Investigation has many textures that never make headlines. The soft thud of a binder closing, the plastic edge of an evidence sleeve, the quiet scrape of a chair as someone stands to check another shelf. And on some days, that work led back to people, which is always the most delicate part. Re-interviewing a witness years later is a different act from interviewing them at the beginning. In the McCann case, a person might be asked about a holiday evening they had tried to put away. They might have moved house, changed jobs, lost relatives, or grown older in ways the file cannot show. You, as the detective, approach carefully because the file's need is not the only need in the room. The witness may be anxious about being wrong. They may have read coverage and fear their memory has been contaminated. They may want to help so badly that they reach beyond what they truly know. A patient interviewer must slow the room down. Tell me what you remember from your own experience. Tell me what you learned later. Tell me where those two things separate. That separation is crucial. Memory and later knowledge can braid together. A person may remember a street because they later saw it on television. They may remember a time because an appeal repeated it. They may remember a face more sharply after seeing an artist's impression. This does not make them dishonest. It makes them human. The McCann case, with its enormous publicity, made that problem sharper. Many witnesses could not remain untouched by public information. Even silence can be influenced by what a person believes everyone already knows. Investigators had to ask questions that helped memory return to its own ground, as far as possible. You can hear the care in that, the gentle insistence on original recall. Sometimes the interview room would have a recorder on the table, a jug of water nearby, maybe the low buzz of a light above. The witness might look at a map and say, "I think it was here," or perhaps it was the next street. The detective would not rush to correct them. The detective would let the uncertainty remain visible, because uncertainty can be more truthful than a polished answer. Re-interviews can also reveal that a detail once considered important was less solid than it seemed. That is useful, though it may feel like loss. A witness may say they are no longer sure. They may withdraw a certainty they once had. The investigator writes that down too. The file must not preserve confidence that the person no longer holds. In the McCann case, where every detail had been examined publicly, such corrections mattered. They helped separate memory from myth. They also reminded everyone that the people in the file were not fixed figures. They were living people trying with imperfect minds and imperfect records to help answer an old question. But while witness work moved through memory, forensic work moved through material traces. Forensic material in the McCann case has always required cautious handling in any calm retelling. There were early forensic examinations, including the apartment and rental vehicle, and there were dog alerts that became widely discussed. There were lab analyses whose meanings were limited and contested. You and I keep the language steady here, because forensic uncertainty is not a space for embellishment. The public sometimes treats forensic evidence as if it either proves everything or proves nothing. Investigators know there is a wide middle. A result can be partial. A result can be degraded. A result can be mixed. A result can be insufficient for a conclusion, yet still useful in directing further work. The file's language is often careful because the science requires care. You can imagine the evidence packaging, the labels, the seals, the signatures, and the chain of custody forms. Each item needs its history preserved. Who collected it? When? From where? How was it stored? Who examined it? What method was used? In a case that may one day face legal scrutiny, the history of the object can matter almost as much as the object itself. The passage of time complicates this. Materials degrade. Earlier testing may consume part of a sample. Storage conditions matter. New techniques may become available, but only if usable material remains. Cold case investigators often live with the question of whether to retest now or preserve for a better future method. You can feel the patience in that decision. Even science sometimes asks you to wait. In the McCann case, forensic questions did not deliver a public answer strong enough to settle the investigation. That fact is important. It means the case could not rest on laboratory certainty alone. Investigators had to continue relying on a wider weave. Witnesses, timelines, searches, phone data, suspect inquiries, and international cooperation. Forensic caution can be frustrating, especially when people want finality. But caution is a kind of respect for the missing person too. It refuses to pretend that a weak result is strong. It refuses to let public pressure turn ambiguity into proof. You can let that feel restful tonight, because honest limits are better than false certainty. There is another sensory world in the lab, far from Praia de Luz. Cool rooms, clean benches, the faint chemical smell of sterile workspaces, gloves snapped lightly at the wrist, labels checked twice, a sample tube held under bright light. This world speaks softly, in probabilities and thresholds, and sometimes it says only that it cannot say enough. When it cannot say enough, the file returns to other kinds of evidence. Phone data, in the later investigation, offered one of those other kinds. It is less emotional than witness memory and less visibly physical than a search field, but it can help place movements in time. In the McCann case, phone records became part of later suspect inquiry and wider review. You can picture columns of calls, numbers, cell sites and times, each one plain until someone asks the right question of it. Phone evidence from 2007 was not like the location data people imagine from later smartphones. It could show connections in general areas, depending on records and cell towers, but it did not always draw a neat path. Investigators had to understand those limits. A phone connecting near Praia de Luz could matter, but only in relation to other facts. The work of analyzing such data can be slow and dry. Number compared with number. Subscriber records requested, dates aligned, calls mapped against known events. You follow the rows with your eyes until they blur slightly. Then you stand, stretch, and return. Somewhere in that dry repetition, a pattern may appear or fail to appear, and either result matters. If a suspect's phone was active in a relevant area at a relevant time, investigators would ask, what else supports that? Was the person known to be nearby? Did a vehicle match? Did a witness place them there? Did they have access, motive, opportunity, or later behavior that mattered? In the McCann case, no single data point could carry the entire weight. Everything needed company. This is a quiet truth about evidence. It likes company. One piece alone may be suggestive. Several pieces, properly gathered, may begin to support each other. But if they do not truly connect, forcing them together can mislead everyone. You, at the desk, learn to let evidence stand near other evidence without tying knots too quickly. Phone data also shows the value of preservation. If records are not saved early, they may vanish. If they are saved, later, investigators can ask new questions. Cold cases often turn on what someone thought to preserve before anyone knew exactly why it mattered. The McCann case reminds us that preservation is one of investigation's quiet acts of faith. It says, perhaps this will matter later. Keep it. The same is true of photographs, maps, witness lists, and search logs. A photograph taken for one purpose may later reveal a detail useful for another. A map marked during an early search may show that an area was covered or not covered with enough precision to decide whether it needs revisiting. You can imagine how an old search log, plain and dusty, might save weeks of duplicated work. In the McCann case, search history mattered because many places were considered over time. Apartment areas, nearby streets, open land, coastal spaces, wells, roads, and later more distant locations connected to suspect inquiry. Each search had to be recorded. If no result was found, that absence became part of the investigation's map. A search that finds nothing may look empty from outside, but inside the file, it draws a boundary. It says, we looked here under these conditions, with these methods, on this date. Future investigators can decide whether that is enough. Maybe it is. Maybe technology or new information justifies looking again. But the old search is not nothing. It is a statement made in ground and time. You can feel the physical fatigue of search work. The sun on the back of the neck, dust at the cuffs, the weight of equipment, the low voices of officers trying not to disturb each other's focus, the smell of dry grass, damp soil, or reservoir mud. These sensory things belong to investigation as much as the paperwork does. Search teams also carry emotional discipline. They cannot let hope make them careless. They cannot let disappointment make them hurried. Each area must be treated properly, whether it feels promising or not. In the McCann case, where searches were watched by media, that discipline had to remain steady under observation. Cameras may change the atmosphere, but they cannot change the method. And method, more than emotion, is what keeps a long investigation from scattering. The method in the McCann case had to include periodic review. A cold case cannot simply continue in the same shape forever. Supervisors need to ask what remains active, what has been exhausted, what new information exists, and what resources are justified. This is administrative, but it is also investigative. A fresh review can notice a stale assumption or a neglected lead. You can imagine a meeting table with printed timelines, action logs, and a list of unresolved matters. The atmosphere is not dramatic. Someone pours water. Someone checks a date. Someone asks whether a request to another country has been answered. The McCann case, in such a room, becomes both a human absence and a set of manageable questions. Managing questions is important because a famous case can become overwhelming. If every unresolved matter is treated as equally urgent, nothing can be done well. Investigators have to prioritize. Which lead has evidential value? Which lead is only public repetition? You can see the calm triage in that. Prioritizing does not mean dismissing Madeleine. It means giving the work a chance to be effective. A case this large needs structure, or it dissolves into activity without progress. The best investigators know that motion and purpose are different things. They choose purpose, even when purpose looks quiet. Operation Grange's staffing changed over time, which is common in long-running inquiries. A large team reduced to a smaller one. A major review became a focused investigation. The public sometimes reads reduction as abandonment, but it can also mean the work has narrowed. You and I hold that distinction carefully, because not every smaller team means a smaller concern. Funding decisions also became part of the case's rhythm. Requests were made. Extensions were granted. Each extension suggested there remained something to assess or pursue. These decisions were not the same as breakthroughs, though headlines sometimes made them feel that way. They were the practical maintenance of an active file. In the office, such maintenance can look almost ordinary. Calendars, budgets, staffing forms, case management systems. Yet without these ordinary structures, no long investigation survives. You can smell printer paper again, hear the soft ring of an office phone, and feel the cool plastic edge of an identification badge against a shirt. There is dignity in that ordinary work. It keeps a name from being lost in the volume of other work. It keeps the file accessible. It keeps responsibility assigned. In the McCann case, the name Madeleine McCann remained present because people continued to make room for it inside institutions that have many demands. But institutions are made of people, and people carry their own limits. A detective working an old case may feel frustration, though they may not show it. They may read a promising lead and watch it fail. They may wait months for a response. They may face public criticism for not revealing what cannot responsibly be revealed. They may understand a family's pain while knowing they cannot offer comfort in the form of certainty. You can imagine the private quiet after a difficult meeting. A detective returns to their desk, sets down a notebook, and sits for a moment before typing the next action. The room is still. Outside, traffic moves as if the world has no idea what one file can weigh. Then the work resumes, because resuming is part of the job. The McCann case likely required that kind of emotional regulation from many professionals: Portuguese officers, British detectives, German prosecutors, search specialists, lab staff, liaison officers, translators, and administrators all touched the case in different ways. Some may have worked on it briefly, others may have carried it for years. The file outlasted many individual assignments. There is a particular humility in knowing you may only move a case a little. You may not solve it. You may clarify one sighting. You may eliminate one suspect. You may preserve one record so someone else can use it later. Patient detective work accepts that contribution can be small and still meaningful. For sleep, that idea has its own calm. We do not need the whole answer in one hand. We can honor the people who kept one page in order, one lead properly checked, one witness carefully heard. In the McCann case, where the final answer has remained out of reach, such careful fragments are part of the story. And the family's persistence formed another thread beside the police work. Kate and Jerry McCann kept Madeleine's name in public view for years. They made appeals, supported searches, and asked people to come forward with information. For investigators, family advocacy can be both helpful and complex. It can generate leads and maintain attention. It can also bring public pressure and emotional intensity to a process that must move by evidence. You can understand both sides without needing to choose one against the other. Parents want answers. Police need proof. The family lives with absence every day, while investigators enter and leave the file through professional roles. Those two experiences touch, but they are not the same. In the McCann case, the distance between them had to be crossed many times. Through careful communication. A family liaison role exists partly for that crossing. Someone must explain updates, delays, searches, and limits in a way that is honest and humane. You can imagine how hard that is when there is no final news to give. The voice on the phone must be steady. The words must be kind. The facts must not be stretched. There is no gentle way to live for years with a missing child's case, but there are gentler ways to speak about it. That is what we try to do tonight. We keep away from accusation for its own sake. We do not turn grief into spectacle. We look at the investigation as patient work done around a human absence. The public sometimes forgets that families in famous cases are not public property. Every anniversary statement, every appeal, every photograph exists against the background of private rooms and ordinary mornings. You can picture a kitchen table, a calendar, a phone that may ring with news or may not. The McCann case was public, but its wound was not. Investigators, too, would have understood that anniversaries can stir both tips and distress. Around the date of Madeleine's disappearance, media coverage often increased. People might call in with memories. Others might repeat theories. The family might be asked again to speak. The case would rise into public light, then settle back. You can feel that annual tide. For police, anniversaries can be useful moments for appeals. They catch attention. They may reach someone who was not ready before. But they also require care, because each public appeal returns the family to the center of attention. In the McCann case, the balance between usefulness and pain was never simple, and beyond the family, the case touched the lives of many witnesses who never expected to become part of a file. The holiday friends, sometimes referred to publicly as the Tappers Group, had their movements and statements examined for years. Resort staff were asked about routines, guests, maintenance, doors, and observations. Nearby residents were asked what they heard or saw. Other holidaymakers gave statements that became part of a much larger record than they could have imagined. You can sit with the ordinariness of those people before the file found them. To be a witness in a famous case can be unsettling. A detail you mention once may be repeated for years. A time you estimate may be treated as exact by strangers. Your uncertainty may be ignored by people building theories. Investigators have to understand this pressure, especially when recontacting witnesses long after the event. You can imagine a witness opening an old email from police, or answering a call, and feeling the past step back into the room. They may remember the smell of the resort, the evening air, the route to dinner, the voice of someone asking questions. They may also remember the discomfort of public attention. The detective must make space for that before asking for details again. The McCann case depended on witnesses, but witnesses are not machines. They carry embarrassment, fear, helpfulness, fatigue, and confusion. A skilled investigator listens through all of that, trying to find what is solid without breaking what is fragile. You can feel how much patience that requires. It is not passive listening, it is attentive listening. Some witnesses gave accounts that remained important. Others helped eliminate possibilities. Some may have remembered nothing useful at all. Each role has value. A witness who saw nothing can still define the limits of a scene. A witness who heard nothing can still help establish what was normal. The absence of observation is not always empty. That is a subtle point. But old investigations are full of subtle points. The McCann case required attention, not only to what people said they saw, but to where people were when they did not see anything. If a route was busy, why was a movement unnoticed? If a street was quiet, who might have passed? If a door was accessible, who would know? These questions are gentle on the surface and exact underneath. You can hear them asked in a calm interview room, one at a time, with pauses long enough for memory to settle. As the years went on, technology changed the way old witness material could be organized. Statements could be indexed and searched more easily. Names could be cross-checked against other databases. Maps could be digitized. Timelines could be rebuilt with software. Yet the underlying act remained the same. A person said something, and another person had to understand what it meant. In the McCann case, that meant understanding a multilingual record. Portuguese statements, English statements, translations, summaries, and later interpretations all existed together. A small translation choice can matter. A word like shutter, blind, window, or door may carry practical meaning. You can imagine investigators checking original language to avoid building a conclusion on a translation that was only approximate. Translation is not only about words, it is about police procedure, cultural assumptions, and legal terms. The Portuguese arguido status, for example, has a specific meaning in that legal system, and careless translation can mislead people into thinking it is identical to other forms of suspect status. You, at the desk, let the legal term remain precise. because precision protects everyone. This level of care is slow. It asks investigators to pause over things the public may skip. It asks them to look up original phrases, consult native speakers, and compare versions. It may feel small, but old cases can turn on small misunderstandings. The McCann case, because it lived in more than one language, made that care essential. But language was only one border the investigation crossed. There were also borders of law and jurisdiction. Portugal controlled the original crime scene and local investigative powers. Britain had responsibility for supporting its citizens and later conducting Operation Grange. Germany became central through its suspect inquiry. Each country had its own prosecutors, police structures, courts, and evidential rules. You can imagine how many desks a single question might have to visit. A request to search a location in Portugal could not be treated like a domestic British action. A German prosecutor's evidence could not simply be placed in a British public appeal without legal consideration. A Portuguese procedural step might carry meaning that British audiences misunderstood. The McCann case required not only detectives, but interpreters of systems. This is one reason old international cases move with such care. Every action has to be lawful where it happens and useful where it may later be needed. That requires patience before action, not because action is unwanted, but because careless action can damage a case. You can feel the restraint there, like a hand resting on a folder until the right permission arrives. The public sees delay. The investigator sees sequence. First, the request, then approval, then coordination, then execution, then reporting, then translation, then assessment. If anything found may matter in another country, further steps follow. The McCann case lived inside these sequences for many years, and while the systems moved, the public conversation often moved faster. Online discussion transformed the McCann case into a constant subject for speculation. Forums, social media posts, videos, and comment threads produced theories at a speed no investigation could match. Some people examined documents carefully, others spread errors. Many spoke with certainty that the evidence did not support. You can feel why a calm narrator must lower the volume here. Investigators cannot chase every online claim as if it were equal to evidence. They may monitor public information, but they must prioritize material that can be sourced and checked. A theory without a witness, document, record, or physical basis remains only a theory. In the McCann case, separating genuine leads from public noise became part of the work. This separation is not always easy, because public noise can contain a real lead by accident. Someone may post a memory online rather than call police. Someone may identify a vehicle in a photograph. Someone may share a document that should be verified. Investigators need enough openness to notice useful material and enough discipline not to be pulled into every swirl. You can imagine the case management system as a quiet counterweight to the internet. Online, claims rise and vanish quickly. In the file, an action is logged, assigned, checked, and closed or kept open. The file moves slowly because it must remember accurately. The internet moves quickly because it does not have to. For sleep, we stay with the file. We let the louder room fall away. The McCann case becomes less frantic when we return to the lamp, the paper, the map, and the patient question of what can actually be known. There is a kindness in refusing to amplify unsupported claims. It protects living people from careless suspicion. It protects the missing child from being lost under arguments. It protects the listener too, allowing you to remain in a contemplative space rather than a restless one. Investigation, at its best, is calm enough to be fair. And fairness also means recognizing what earlier investigators faced without reducing them to mistakes. The first Portuguese officers entered a situation that was urgent, emotional, and unexpected. A child had vanished from a holiday apartment in a resort town. People were searching, calling out, entering rooms, and trying to help. The ideal forensic scene may already have been compromised before the full shape of the case was understood. You can hold that fact without anger. It is easy, years later, to see what should have been sealed, photographed, logged, or preserved. Hindsight has a bright lamp. The first night had fear, darkness, and movement. Investigators later had to live with the consequences of those early conditions, but understanding them helps us speak more gently about the people who were there. That does not mean every choice was beyond criticism. It means criticism should be proportionate and informed. The McCann case has often been discussed in ways that treat early investigators as symbols of competence or failure. The reality was human, procedural, and constrained. Officers worked with the tools, training, language, and circumstances they had in that moment. Later reviews could identify gaps. They could revisit lines of inquiry. They could apply different resources, but they could not recreate the first hours. Cold case work often begins with accepting what the first investigation did and did not preserve. You start from the record as it is, not as you wish it were. This acceptance can feel heavy. A missed opportunity cannot be recovered by caring more later. A contaminated scene cannot be made untouched by reviewing it with better methods. A witness not identified early may become impossible to trace. The McCann case carries such losses, as many old cases do. The investigator's task is not to deny them, but to work around them honestly. You can imagine a detective noting an early gap in the file and sitting with it for a moment. There is no dramatic music there, only the quiet recognition that this part of the road is gone. Then the detective turns to what remains, because what remains is still worth the work. What remained included a remarkable amount of material. Statements, search records, forensic reports, photographs, appeals, suspect lists, phone data, and later cross-border inquiries. The file was incomplete in some ways, and enormous in others. That combination can be difficult. Too little certainty, too much paper. Sorting too much paper is its own kind of burden. You can feel it physically in the wrists and eyes. A long day of reading old statements leaves the mind full of times and names. The same street appears again and again until it becomes almost familiar. The same question returns in slightly different clothing. At night, the detective may still be thinking of a route through Praia de Luz. The McCann case, because it was so public, also required investigators to know what not to read as evidence. A newspaper interview is not the same as a sworn statement. A documentary reconstruction is not the same as a witness account. A forum theory is not the same as a lead. Keeping those categories clear is dull work, and dull work is sometimes what saves an investigation from confusion. You can rest with the dullness. It is not a flaw in the story. It is the real texture of patient detective work. There were moments, though, when the file would have felt suddenly more present. A new appeal, a new suspect development, a planned search, a request from German authorities, a possible witness located after years. These moments do not need to be described with urgency. They are simply the times when the quiet room becomes more focused, and people lean closer to the paper. Before a search, there is preparation. Maps are reviewed, legal permissions checked, equipment arranged, roles assigned, media strategy considered. If the location is sensitive, privacy and logistics must be managed. In the McCann case, any visible action near Praia de Luz or another location could attract attention. So planning had to include both investigative needs and public realities. You can imagine the morning before such work. Officers arrive early. The air is cool before the heat rises. Someone checks batteries. Someone folds a map. Someone confirms the boundary of the search area. There is no sense of drama among professionals, only concentration. The work will be done whether cameras are nearby or not. During a search, everyone understands that most moments will produce nothing. That knowledge does not make the search meaningless. It makes concentration harder. You move slowly through ground that may be empty, and you treat it as if it may not be. This is patience in its most physical form. After a search, there is another kind of work. Items, if any, must be catalogued. Notes must be written. Photographs stored. Reports prepared. If nothing was found, that must be recorded with the same seriousness. The public may move on quickly, but the file keeps the record. The McCann case grew through such records, even when no answer came from them. The same cycle applies to interviews and appeals. Preparation, action, documentation, assessment. Then the long wait for what comes next. Waiting is not empty time in an investigation. It allows replies to arrive, lab work to finish, witnesses to consider, other agencies to respond, and investigators to think without forcing the file. You can imagine the McCann case during such waiting periods, sitting on a desk or in a case system, not forgotten, but not loudly active. A quiet file can still be alive. There is a difference between dormant and dead. Dormant means a case is waiting for new information, new permission, or new analysis. Dead would mean no one expects or intends to act. The McCann case has repeatedly returned from quiet periods into active work, which tells us the file retained possible paths. You can feel that slow pulse beneath the years. For families, waiting has a different texture. It is not professional waiting. It is personal. It fills birthdays, anniversaries, ordinary meals, and quiet mornings. Investigators may step away from the file at the end of the day, but families do not step away from absence in the same way. Remembering that keeps the investigation human. A good detective knows this, but cannot be ruled by it. They cannot give hope where the evidence does not. They cannot hurry a legal process because grief is unbearable. They can only work carefully and communicate honestly. In the McCann case, that tension sat beside almost every public update, and while we sit with that tension, we can look at how the case changed the idea of a cold case in the public mind. The McCann case was unusual because it stayed active in public consciousness from the beginning. Many cold cases become cold through silence. This one became cold under a bright light. That created a different kind of challenge. The file was old, but not forgotten. The evidence aged, but the arguments stayed fresh. You can imagine how that affected every new development. When a case is forgotten, investigators may struggle for attention and resources. When a case is famous, investigators may struggle for space and calm. Both conditions are hard. The McCann case shows the second difficulty clearly. Too many voices can make careful listening harder. Still, public awareness did some necessary work. It kept Madeline's image in circulation. It helped generate tips. It supported continued funding. It meant that people who might have been in Portugal, Britain, Germany, Ireland, Spain, or elsewhere could recognize the case years later. You can hold that benefit alongside the burden. This is one of the recurring patterns tonight. Almost every force in the McCann case did two things at once. Media helped and harmed. Time clarified and eroded. Public attention preserved and distorted. International cooperation widened the inquiry and slowed it. A named suspect focused attention and raised legal caution. Patient investigation lives in those mixed realities. You can sit with mixed realities more easily when the room is quiet. We do not need to resolve them into simple lessons. We can let them remain layered. That is closer to how detectives experience old cases. Rarely does a file say only yes or only no. More often, it says yes, but no, unless. Possible, not proven. Worth checking, not enough. These phrases are not exciting, but they are truthful. They are the vocabulary of investigators who have learned not to confuse strong feeling with strong evidence. The McCann case, perhaps more than many others, required that vocabulary every time it was reopened in public. And reopening, in this case, happened many times in different forms. There was the official Portuguese investigation, then archiving, then reopening. There was the British Review, then full investigation. There were private efforts, public appeals, documentaries, and later the German suspect inquiry. Each reopening brought a different kind of energy, and each had to face the same old absence. You can imagine the file being lifted from shelves again and again, never light in the hands. A reopened case can give investigators a fresh mandate. It can also bring old frustrations back to the surface. Why was this not done earlier? Why was that lead missed? Can this witness still be found? Is this evidence still usable? You read those questions gently, because they are practical questions with emotional edges. Sometimes reopening means recontacting people who are tired of the case. Sometimes it means asking a family to endure renewed public attention. Sometimes it means telling the public that a search has found no answer. Yet without reopening, an old case may never benefit from new eyes. The McCann case shows why reopening is both costly and necessary. For the detective, the best reason to reopen is not publicity. It is a viable line of inquiry. A new witness, a new suspect connection, a new forensic possibility, a changed understanding of an old sighting. You can see how Operation Grange began with a broad review and gradually narrowed toward specific lines, as serious investigations tend to do. Narrowing can feel like progress, but it can also be lonely. A broad case has many possibilities. A narrow case has fewer places to hide from uncertainty. When a key line does not produce a charge or answer, the remaining silence can feel deeper. Investigators in the McCann case had to continue working through that narrowing without pretending it was resolution. This is one reason the named suspect development in 2020 was so significant and still not final. It gave a focus, but not a public ending. It suggested that German authorities believed they had a meaningful direction, but it did not produce a completed legal account. You, at the desk, keep both parts visible. The file can change shape without closing. That may be the central experience of investigating the McCann case over many years. You can imagine, now, a row of folders labeled by theme: timeline, apartment, witnesses, sightings, searches, forensics, phone records, persons of interest, media appeals, international requests, German inquiry. Each folder has its own internal order, but none can answer alone. The investigator moves between them slowly, like someone walking from room to room in a quiet house. In the timeline folder, the evening is examined again. In the apartment folder, access points and early scene handling return. In the witness folder, memories speak with differing confidence. In the sightings folder, the Tanner account changes weight and the Smith account remains notable. In the search folder, ground is marked as covered or still considered. In the phone folder, numbers sit in columns, waiting for context. This mental organization helps the case become workable. Without it, the McCann case is simply too large. With it, investigators can ask one question at a time. What does this folder show? What does it not show? What other folder must it be compared with? You can feel the calm of that method, the way a large uncertainty becomes a series of smaller uncertainties. Smaller uncertainties are still uncertainties, but they can be handled. You can write them down. You can assign actions. You can close some and keep others open. A detective cannot live inside a cloud forever. They need edges. The file provides edges when it is organized with care. This is why case management is more than clerical work. It is thinking made visible. A well-organized file allows future investigators to understand what happened before them. It prevents old mistakes from being reborn as new leads. It shows respect for the missing person by making the work durable. The McCann case needed that durability because it outlived many phases of attention. Durability also depends on tone. Official records should be calm. They should not exaggerate. They should separate fact from interpretation. They should note uncertainty plainly. You can imagine how valuable such tone becomes years later, when a new team reads the file and needs to know what was truly known at the time. The tone we use tonight is similar for that reason. Calm is not avoidance. Calm is accuracy with care, and care brings us back to the people who are asked to remember the smallest things. A witness might remember a door being open or closed, or something about a curtain. Another might remember a man walking, but not his face. Someone might remember a vehicle parked where it seemed out of place. Someone else might remember nothing unusual, and that too becomes part of the picture. In the McCann case, these fragments had to be arranged without forcing them to become more complete than they were. The mind remembers with texture, light, weather, mood, sound, smell. A person may remember the feel of an evening more clearly than a time on a clock. They may remember being tired, carrying a child, hearing voices, or noticing someone because they moved differently. Investigators have to translate that textured memory into factual questions. You can imagine asking, was the street lamp behind him or in front of him? Were you walking uphill or downhill? Did the child seem awake or asleep? Did you hear footsteps? Was there traffic? Did you speak to anyone immediately afterward? Such questions are gentle in tone, but precise in purpose. The Smith family's account, because it involved a man carrying a child through Praia de Luz, became one of those textured memories. It remained discussed because it was specific enough to matter and uncertain enough to require caution. You hold both qualities at once. The sighting had weight, and it did not identify a person with legal finality. When British investigators later appealed around that sighting, they were not presenting it as an answer. They were using it as a way to reach someone who might add context. Perhaps someone knew the man. Perhaps someone saw the same movement from another angle. Perhaps the person himself would come forward with an innocent explanation. That is how appeals often work. They ask the unknown to identify itself. Sometimes the unknown does identify itself, as with the Tanner sighting. A man carrying his child from the night creche could account for a report once seen as central. That resolution did not solve the McCann case, but it showed the value of asking the public carefully. One uncertainty became less uncertain, and the file adjusted. There is a quiet satisfaction in that kind of correction. Not triumph, just order. A piece moved to the proper place, a shadow understood. In patient detective work, such moments matter. They prove that review can clarify, even when it cannot conclude. And every clarification brings the investigator back to what remains. What remained after many reviews was still difficult. Madeleine McCann had disappeared from a holiday apartment. The immediate search had not found her. The early scene had limitations. Reported sightings had to be weighed. Forensic material did not resolve the case, and later suspect inquiries had not produced a public legal ending. You do not need to rush past that. It is the shape of the file. For an investigator, that shape can be heavy, but also familiar. Many cold cases remain unsolved, not because no one tried, but because the evidence never formed a bridge strong enough to cross. The McCann case is unusually well known, yet it shares that quiet truth with many less famous files resting in archives around the world. You can imagine those other files for a moment, not to leave the topic, but to understand its company. Folders in county buildings, boxes in police basements, photographs in sleeves, names on labels, someone missing, someone waiting, someone retired who still remembers. The McCann case stands in brighter light, but the patience it requires belongs to a larger world of unresolved human questions. That larger world has taught investigators certain habits: preserve what you can, recheck assumptions, treat witnesses respectfully, record negative results, keep legal language precise, avoid public certainty before evidential certainty, return to the scene if the scene can still teach, listen when new information arrives, but make it prove itself. All of those habits appear in the McCann case. Some were learned painfully, some came through later review, some guided the continuing work. You can feel them gathering around the file, like quiet tools laid out on a desk: a ruler, a map, a notebook, a cup gone cold, a stack of statements, a phone with no new message. The tools of patient detective work are not dramatic, but they are faithful in their way. And faithfulness, in this context, means continuing to ask the right questions without pretending the answer is already known. When you sit with the McCann case long enough, you may begin to notice how often investigators had to resist pressure from both directions. Some voices insisted there was an obvious answer in one place. Other voices insisted there was an obvious answer elsewhere. The file, however, did not settle so easily. It asked for patience when people wanted certainty. That resistance is part of professional courage. It is not loud. It may not be praised. A detective who says, "We cannot say that yet," may disappoint everyone in the room. But that sentence can protect the case. It can also protect innocent people, grieving people, and future legal work. You can let that quiet courage matter tonight. In the McCann case, careful public statements often left room for ongoing inquiry. They did not reveal everything. They did not satisfy every question. They used cautious phrases because cautious phrases were appropriate. For a famous case, such restraint can be misunderstood, but restraint is sometimes the only ethical posture available. The same restraint belongs in our retelling. We focus on what it was like to investigate, the reviewing, the searching, the waiting, the translating, the comparing, the coordinating, the re-interviewing, the resisting of rumor, and the continuing return to one night in Praia de Luz. We do not need to solve what the file itself has not solved. There is calm in that acceptance. Not comfort, exactly, but calm. It allows us to remain with the human work, instead of chasing a false ending. It allows the investigation to be what it was: long, imperfect, persistent, and deeply shaped by the absence at its center. And now, as the file moves into its later years, the rhythm becomes even quieter, though the work does not disappear. The later years of the McCann case were marked by fewer public movements and more careful statements. That is natural as an investigation narrows or waits on particular lines. Public attention may rise when a suspect is mentioned, a search occurs, or an anniversary arrives, then settle again. Inside the file, however, the question remains present. You can imagine a smaller team handling incoming information. A tip arrives. It is logged. It is compared with existing material. Perhaps it is new, perhaps not. A request is sent. A reply is awaited. Most days do not change the public record. Still, they belong to the investigation. In such a phase, endurance becomes almost invisible. The work does not announce itself. It does not produce regular updates. It may depend on prosecutors in another country, legal thresholds, or evidence that cannot be discussed. The public may assume nothing is happening. The file may know otherwise. The McCann case, by this point, had become a long conversation between what could be said and what had to be held back. German authorities said they believed they had a suspect. British police continued to support the investigation and treat Madeleine as missing. Portuguese authorities maintained their procedural role. These positions existed together, not always satisfying, but real. For the listener tonight, the important thing is not to force those positions into one voice. Each agency speaks from its own legal place. Each has limits. Each has responsibilities. You can imagine 3 lamps on 3 desks, each lighting a different section of the same wide map. The map still leads back to the Algarve. It still leads back to apartment 5A. It still leads back to the evening checks, the sightings, the early searches, the later reviews, and the suspect inquiries that followed. The McCann case is large, but it is not shapeless. Its shape is made by returns. You return to the date. You return to the room. You return to the witnesses. You return to the roads. You return to the files. Each return is slower than the last, perhaps, but not meaningless. Sometimes an old question can only be honored by being asked carefully one more time. And there is still one kind of patience we have not fully sat with yet. The patience of not knowing what another office knows. And there is still one kind of patience we have not fully sat with yet. The patience of not knowing what another office knows. You can imagine the investigator accepting that some papers are sealed elsewhere, some tests are unfinished elsewhere, and some decisions belong to prosecutors in rooms far from the first warm night in Praia de Luz. That patience is not passive. It is the quiet discipline of leaving space for lawful work, even when the heart would like every answer laid out under the lamp. In the McCann case, the file has crossed so many desks that no single hand can close it by wanting to. It has to wait for proof, for procedure, and for whatever truth can still be gathered from old records, old places, and people who may yet remember. So before we let the night grow softer, we state the real shape of it plainly. Madeleine McCann has never been found, and the case remains unsolved. No one has been convicted for her disappearance, and no charge has brought the story to a final courtroom answer. Operation Grange and related inquiries have continued across the years, while German authorities have pursued their suspect line, but the answer itself has not arrived in the world where families can hold it. That is where the file rests, not closed, not finished, and not forgotten. You can leave it there without forcing it into a shape it does not have. The papers remain in their folders, the maps remain marked, and the unanswered spaces remain exactly as they are, difficult but honestly kept. For tonight, you do not have to solve the McCann case. You have only sat beside the people who tried, and beside the long, careful work of returning to a question without making it louder than the evidence allows. The lamp can stay low now. The sea beyond Praia de Luz can be only a distant sound, and the old file can lie still for a while, holding its silence gently enough that you may set it down and rest.